All right. So we are still talking about the great harlot and her representation being the city of Rome and then its fall. We looked at in chapter 17, remember the angel said, I will show you her judgment. And then what he proceeded to do is not show her execution. He showed really who she is and what she does. So this is more like a judge giving sentence. He's saying this is what you're accused of, this is what you're convicted of, this is what's been proven, and now we're getting to the actual punishment, the actual execution of that. And then we noticed last time that we have this warning that's interjected for God's people. This presumably is Jesus speaking, calling his people out of the city so they don't get caught up in the fall. I think this is most importantly spiritually not getting caught up, but also physically as well. And we almost got done with this section looking at the fall, and we noticed how she had this cup of intoxicating drink, and then the Lord's response was, well, take that cup, mix what she gave out, mix it back in there for her to drink. So what she had given to others, that would be measured back to her, and that would represent a doubling or a balancing of the scales. Now, this next question is actually very closely tied to that, and it's kind of unfortunate it was broken up in this way. So we're told that something would happen to Babylon in one day. So let's start with that easy question first. What was supposed to happen to Babylon in one day?
Death, mourning, famine, and be burned in fire.
Yeah, and all of the plagues too. All this was supposed to be taken care of. So did this happen?
Not literally in one day.
This is a difficult passage, and so we're going to touch on this a little bit, but we're going to come back to it where it becomes even more pointed here at the end of the chapter. So her plagues will come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she will be utterly burned with fire. For strong is the Lord God who judges her. So again, the thing that we keep going back to over and over again, this is a book of symbols. There is, especially as we're looking at this part, there is this pull to try to interpret it literally, especially as we see some of these things literally apply to previous Old Testament ancient cities. But I think that's still a mistake. So if it's not literal, if it's symbolic, then what are we supposed to understand from this? So we're going to talk about this more at the end of the chapter in verses 21 and 24, but I think there's a few things to notice first. This obviously emphasizes the certainty, the surety. This is something that's going to happen. And the fact that for strong is the Lord God who judges her. So her inability to push this off, to stop this. God's going to bring about this judgment, and there's nothing that she can ultimately do to stop it. So, I mean, obviously she could have repented, but beyond that, there's nothing that can be done at this point. So there's also the sense in which this is this one day, it's going to feel like it came out of nowhere. And so this suddenness, this unexpected nature is going to happen in large part because she was blind to the fact that this was happening. We've had the seals, the trumpets, the bowls. There's been this warning that has been coming. Things have been falling apart, and she's not really responding to that. Why is she not responding to it? Because she's got her eyes covered and she doesn't want to hear it. She doesn't want to believe it. The people of Rome think that they're invincible. And so when something finally does happen that they cannot avoid, it's going to feel like it's just coming out of nowhere. Where did this come from? So again, borrowing from some Old Testament passages from Isaiah 47, Ezekiel 28, I think you can see the same points there. And you see not only the same language, but again, you see the emphasis on the arrogance of the people that they thought that they were invincible. So we've seen this passage before, speaking about ancient Babylon in Isaiah 47, 5-10. Sit in silence, go into darkness, O daughter of the Chaldeans, for you shall no longer be called the lady of the kingdoms. Again, it harkens back to the mother of the harlots. You said, I shall be a lady forever, so that you did not take these things to heart, nor remember the latter end of them. Therefore, hear this now, you who are given to pleasures, who dwell securely. Again, focus on they think that they're invincible. Who dwell securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one else beside me. All right, what's significance about the language I am? What is that suggesting? Who else says that? and says it rightly?
God.
God. This is the language of deity. This is the language of God. I am. And there is no one else beside me. I shall not sit as a widow, nor shall I know the loss of children. But these two things shall come to you in a moment, in one day. So it's the exact same language. The loss of children and widowhood, they shall come upon you in their fullness because of the multitude of your sorceries, for the great abundance of your enchantments. For you have trusted in your wickedness. You have said, no one sees me. Your wisdom and your knowledge have warped you. And you have said in your heart, I am, and there is no one else beside me. Similar language in chapter 14. Also reminds me of just Nebuchadnezzar. Remember him in Daniel 4:30 at kind of the peak of his arrogance. Standing there, just kind of, you can almost imagine him on the balcony, just kind of looking out over the city saying, is this not great Babylon that I've built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power, for the honor of my majesty? And in that moment, remember, he was essentially turned into a beast and sent into the wild to live. Ezekiel 28, 2-10, Son of man, say to the prince of Tyre, because your heart is lifted up, saying, I'm a god, I sit in the seat of gods, you are a man, not a god. You set your heart as the heart of God, because you have set your heart as the heart of God. Behold, therefore, I'll bring strangers against you. They will draw their swords against the beauty of your wisdom and defile your splendor. They will throw you down into the pit, and you shall die the death of the slain in the midst of the seas. Will you still say before him who slays you, I am a god? But you shall be a man and not a god, in the hand of him who slays you. So this same language, I sit as a queen, again, untouchable. This same kind of punishment is being dished out to these people, given out to these people because, in some measure, because of their arrogance. And so, as we go through the book of Revelation, it's always important that we take a little bit of time to think, okay, well, how does this affect me? We are not emperors. We are not kings. We will not have that opportunity. However, the opportunity for arrogance and the blindness that's associated to that comes to all of us. Each of us kind of walk that line every day and have to be careful. And the more successful, the more we do good in any area of our life, whether it's developing intelligence or restraint or spiritual wisdom, all of those things, if we are not careful, can become a danger to kind of, poke our chest out and pat ourselves on the back and say, look what I've done by my might and by my power, and forget God, whose grace and forgiveness and help has been with us all the way. So this is the major theme throughout the scripture. 2 Samuel 22:28, saying, God, you will save the humble people, but your eyes are on the haughty, that you may bring them down. And then you're familiar with the passages in Proverbs 11:2, 16:18, and 29:23 about pride going before destruction and the haughty spirit before a fall. So something for us to think about, even though this may seem like it's far removed from us, it's actually very close. All right, so this was a fall that was inevitable. It was to be avoided by God's people. We've seen the reasons for that, and now what we're going to do in the rest of the chapter is look at the reaction of that. All right, so having completed her sentencing, we now move into the actual judgment. What we're going to see now is, remember, the instruction was, come out, my people. Now we're going to look at 3 different groups who did not come out. They didn't hear it, they weren't listening, they didn't care, they were not coming out. So what's the point of this? We're not getting the battle. We are not those people, so what's the point? I think there is a warning that is being emphasized for us by focusing on the consequences of ignoring it. The other thing is we're also seeing the broad impact of her destruction. How many people this is affecting, how grand the scale is of this destruction. And the other thing is we are also seeing emphasized again God's justice. Rome, not just the governors, not just the decadent people of the city, there were all these other groups that were complicit in her wickedness. And what we're seeing is these groups who not only enabled it, contributed, benefited from it, but they were also compromised by it. So they also participated in the sin, and God is dealing with them as well. So, and this is also going to set up a lot of contrast for us as well as we look later at how heaven and its inhabitants are going to react. All right, so group number one. Why did the kings of the earth mourn over Babylon's fall? What was their reason?
They lived luxuriously with her, it said, so it could be both that they've lost a sense of pleasure from their association with her, but it could also be sort of potentially a wake up call for them to see what that leads to in like mourning what they've done.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So, looking at chapter 18, verses 9 to 10, the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her will weep and lament for her when they see the smoke of her burning, saying, Alas, alas, that great city Babylon, that mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. I didn't mention this last time, but remember how long were the 10 horns going to reign? Remember, they were going to get power? 1 hour. We're going to see that 1 hour in this chapter 3 times. So I don't know if there's any relation there, but I think probably not. Probably just that in both cases it's emphasized that it's just a short little while. All right, so Rome provided this very sinful pleasure and the decadent luxury of the kings. But remember, what was the price that they had to pay? They had to not only give over part of their power, but they had to take up her agenda, her war. They also had to drive this persecution against the saints as well. So it's not just that they had luxury. It's the fact that what did they give up? What did they compromise to have that luxury? And it's for that compromise, for that sin, that they are being judged. So in much the same way, like you remember the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. Why was the rich man ultimately judged? Was it because he was rich? It was because he had opportunity to do good and he failed to do that good. But his riches is what's called out when he's in Hades there, and he's actually suffering. That he's reminded by Abraham, you had luxury in your time, but now it is Lazarus's time that he is being blessed. So they had their opportunity, and they obtained it through sin, and they did nothing good with it as well. So double condemnation there. So the other thing is every time you see the devil or anybody acting on his behalf who is making promises, what is the likelihood that they can and that they will keep good on those promises? Very, very poor. The devil just about never keeps his promises, and never at the level that we're expecting. So there's a sense in which the power they hoped for, all the blessings they hoped for, none of those things are going to materialize. So all the compromises they had made trying to get something, they're not going to get that. Also, because it happens quickly, they're not going to be able to do anything about it. They can't, rebalance their investments. All their eggs were in this one basket, and they've lost everything at this point as well. So this is a very selfish mourning because they've lost this pleasure. They have been taken over by this intoxication. They bought into this. They lived luxuriously for a little while, but now all of that is gone, and everything they had hoped for and promised, and the promises they had accepted, that is all gone. All right, similar kind of question. Merchants of the earth, why are they mourning?
Because no one will buy their cargo anymore.
That's right. They've got all these goods. They've got all this cargo, and nobody's going to buy it anymore. So this is kind of an unusual one to me on a couple of reasons. And the merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her, for no one buys their merchandise anymore. Could have stopped right there. But he doesn't. Merchandise of gold and silver, precious stones and pearls, fine linen and purple, silk, scarlet, every kind of citron wood, every object of ivory, most precious wood, bronze, iron, marble, cinnamon, incense, fragrant oil, frankincense, wine, oil. Okay, how many of us in the back of our minds like, I get it. But he keeps going. Fine flour, wheat, cattle, sheep, horses, chariots, bodies and souls of men. So even though it's just a small part of the list, one of the major sins was the slavery and the slave trade that they were involved in, conquering other nations, enslaving them, putting them to forced labor, and putting them into positions of having to do all kinds of different service. So both body and soul. The fruit, so again, it's kind of hinting at the spiritual mistreatment of these people as well. The fruit that your soul longed for is gone from you. All the things which are rich and splendid have gone from you, and you shall find them no more at all. So the merchants of these things, they become rich. They weep, alas, the great city that was clothed in fine linen, purple and scarlet. So go back to our scene. Remember how the harlot was dressed? How this is that city arrayed in that way. Arrayed with gold and precious stones and pearls. So nobody's going to buy their stuff anymore. Again, very upset, but again, very selfish as well. So I want to talk a little bit more about the kind of the expression and the extent here, but let's talk about the ship owners and sailors first. Why did they mourn her fall?
Kind of like the merchants, they become rich by the city.
All right. They've become rich by her as well, in a very similar way to the merchants. So every shipmaster, all who travel by ship, sailors, as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance and cried out when they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, "What is like this great city?" They threw dust on their heads and cried out, weeping and wailing, saying, "Alas, alas, that great city in which all who had ships on the sea became rich by her wealth. For in 1 hour she is made desolate." Okay, same thing, just like the kings, just like the merchants, they're mourning the destruction of the city, but they're not concerned about the people. They're not concerned about the spiritual impact. They're just concerned about my wealth, my riches, my economy. It's gone. That's what they're concerned about. So this chapter and the vision of these three parties draws very heavily from Ezekiel 27, which depicts Tyre's fall, but it depicts it as a giant ship. Not just a single ship, but like a ship with ships within it, like a carrier almost, would be kind of like the best thing that we could imagine. But, something unknown to that time and maybe even beyond ours as well. So I want to just briefly look at that, and because I think it presses the point that we were looking at in the last passage. And I want you to think about, I want to ask kind of at the end, what's the point of all of this list? I mean, sometimes when people, especially as they get older, and their minds don't work as well, maybe they get a little carried away with themselves, or for whatever reason, they just kind of keep going on with the point. That's not God. He hasn't lost control of his faculties. He's not got on a roll and can't stop. There's a reason why he's listing all of these things. So I want you to tell me what you think it is here at the end of this. I won't read all these like I did in the last one. So in Ezekiel 27, he starts up again. Notice we're talking about a specific city, a specific country, if you will, a city country. "Now, son of man, take up a lamentation for Tyre, and say to Tyre, you who are situated at the entrance of the sea, merchant of the peoples on many coastlands, Tyre, you have said, I am perfect in beauty. Your borders are in the midst of the seas. Your builders have perfected your beauty. They made all your planks of fir trees from Sinir. They took a cedar from Lebanon to make you a mast. Of oaks from Bashan they made your oars. The company of Asherites have inlaid your planks with ivory from the coast of Cyprus, fine embroidered linen." And he goes on talking about the sail and the people that did the caulk and that were the oars. And they've made all this. And again, notice all the ships of the sea are within this ship. And they've made your beauty perfect. They have people coming in bringing shields and spears. So it's a fortified carrier, if you will. He goes on talking about all of the goods and all of the different people they've interacted with. Tarshish, silver, iron, tin, lead, Javan, Tubal, and Meshach. Human lives again, bronze, Togarmah, with horses, steeds, and mules, people of Dedan, all these different isles bringing ivory and ebony, and the list goes on, and you can read this. And I actually skipped a few verses. Judah is also mentioned in here, as well as Dan being involved as well. And then he goes on to verse 25. The ships of Tarshish were carrying your merchandise, filled, very glorious in the midst of the sea. They took you out into the waters, but the east wind broke you in the midst of the seas. Your riches, your wares. And so you can just think of this giant ship out in the middle of the waters, way off the coast. Your riches, your wares, and your merchandise, your mariners and pilots, your caulkers and merchandisers, all your men of war who are in you, and the entire company which is in your midst will fall into the midst of the seas on the day of your ruin. And then he goes on with the part that's very similar to what we've been reading at the tail end here of chapter 18. They will make their voice heard, they'll cry bitterly, they'll roll around in the ashes, shave themselves completely bald, gird themselves with sackcloth, weep with bitterness of heart, bitterness of wailing. What city is like Tyre, destroyed in the midst of the seas? You enriched kings of the earth, your merchandise, the entire company will fall in the midst. The inhabitants of the isles will be astonished. The kings will be greatly afraid. Their countenance will be troubled. The merchants among the people will hiss at you. You will become a horror and be no more forever. So you can see how it ends very similarly, that you have these same three groups: the people involved with the ship, the people that are the kings, and the people, the merchants, all either being directly destroyed themselves or just being very brokenhearted over the loss of that. So the question I was asking, why the elaboration? Why do you think the great list of all of the different types of merchandise that they were involved in the importing and the exporting of? And then here, I think you got a little bit of a clue. You have in Ezekiel, you have not just the different goods, but the countries that were associated with those different goods. What's the point?
It shows the strength and the wealth of man, the extent of his influence, and then by the fact that it's crushed by God's judgment in 1 hour, it just emphasizes how powerful and how final God's judgment is.
All right. So I think that's a huge piece. Anything else?
Does it show how highly they thought of themselves when really they were nothing without God?
Yeah, I think that's a big piece of it. Actually, I didn't think about that. That's a good thought. There's one other one I was looking for.
I mean, you just mentioned how it talks about the different groups. This is not just one set of people that this judgment is affecting. It's everybody all over the world that is influenced by this.
Yeah, I think those three ideas are very heavily emphasized here, as well as what we've been looking at in chapter 18 as well. Is that they have, first of all, we cannot appreciate the scale of something of this size. And we're like, oh, Rome fell. You know, it just we say it too easily, and it's hard for us to take it in and appreciate all of the people, all of the alliances, all of the politics, everything that had to be done over hundreds of years to build this entire machine and pull it together and make it functioning, and making it not just functioning, but make it powerful and splendid. And all of these countries, all of these alliances, all of these goods, all of these resources, and in the end, what did it do? How did it help them? Was it able to push off and stop? No. Strong is the Lord that fights for his people. It all fell. So it emphasizes the futility and the powerlessness of these alliances compared against God. But as Joshua said, it also emphasizes their misplaced trust, their arrogance, that they were looking to these things and thinking they were safe from any kind of judgment, any kind of retribution, because they had built up this protection. Again, cannot protect against God. So another thing is, and then lastly, when Rome fell, it wasn't just like this city burned. All of these people, this huge machine was affected when this top was decapitated. The entire body went into kind of, terrible shape at this point as the loss of its head. So there was this wide-scale impact as well. So we see all these parties, they're wailing, they're upset. This is catastrophic for them, even though they have not been immediately destroyed in the process. What did they do to prevent or defend her? To defend her or prevent her fall?
Nothing. They stood at a distance and watched.
They stood at a distance and watched. All right, so what's the lesson?
Friends made of wealth and not real friends.
Yeah. The kings of the earth standing at a distance for fear of her torment. Merchants of the earth will stand at a distance for fear of her torment. And then the ships, the sailors, as many as trade on the sea, stood at a distance and cried out. So all three of these parties, they benefited, they took pleasure in Rome, they were compromised by her, and because of the promises, they were heavily invested. As we said, they put all their eggs in that one basket, but in the end, they did absolutely nothing. I think there may be, just as a side note, they standing, will stand, stood at a distance. They didn't do anything before, during, or in the future. I mean, just this is all time. They are not going to do anything about it. They haven't. They're not doing anything. They're not going to do anything about it. So this is a very sure and absolute thing. Don't expect it to kind of change. So very selfish mourning, a very disloyal relationship, and no surprise. I mean, what was Rome doing? Was she persuading and bringing these people in out of a sense of nobility, of right and wrong and principle? No, she was all about power and compromise and seduction. So when the tables got flipped and all the people that she took advantage of were now in the position of advantage and power, they're not going to do anything to help. And so, also, as we've said, none of them were strong enough to do anything about it. So looking at both the strength element, the arrogant side of it, as well as the fact that there was this disloyal, this helps us to kind of step back and take the long view and say, okay, this is where all of that is going. So why would I invest in that? Why would I build my life on that? Whether it's something that falls catastrophically or if it's something that falls maybe naturally in my own lifetime. Why would I invest in that? So thinking about 2 Peter 3:10-14, about the dissolution of all the elements of our universe, everything ending in fire. Then Luke 12:13 as well as 15, where you think about the prodigal son who brought in all of those friends through his wealth, and once his wealth was spent, what does it say? They gave him nothing. No one would give him anything. All these friends, they were gone as soon as the money was dried up. And then 12:13-21, if a man gains the whole world and loses his own soul, what would it profit him? So not putting our trust in wealth, not putting our trust in men, alliances built on men and built on wealth, that will fade. The only alliance, if you will, the only trust, the relationship that we can ultimately build our life on is one in God. So that helps us to think about our investments and whether we're kind of unwittingly starting to serve two masters. Are we not deliberately, directly, but are we through the allocation of our time, our money, our resources, our hobbies, are we building more and more where we're focused on this life instead of the life to come? So when our Rome falls, are we going to be like this people mourning our personal loss? Is that going to be our first reaction? And so if it is, then we need to kind of reconsider our investments and where we're balancing and putting our funds. Thoughts or comments on this before we leave it? So when Caleb and Noah were little, we had like a little Bible book that we would read and have like a little lesson each night. It made me think about this from class, from Stephen's sermon as well. And every time we would finish and would say, okay, what can we say in our prayers tonight based off of what we learned? And so help me not to be like Saul in that I trusted in men or, whatever, right? So they were able to take something every night and add that to her prayer. And so I think the lesson that I wanted to stress for them, and I want us to think about in this as well, is that these things that seem like they're far away and so unrelated, we need to be thinking about them as far as not only our prayers, but making personal application. Don't Help me not to make the mistakes they made. Help me to do the right things like these people did in these challenging situations. And all of these, there's something that we can not only add to our prayers, but maybe more pointedly be making personal application on. I wish we had more time to focus on that, but I trust that'll be something that you'll do as we try to do from time to time. So, in contrast to this, how are God's people represented against these three parties? What's the contrast that's drawn here?
They have joy.
Yeah, they see the destruction and they respond in joy. Rejoice over her, O heaven, and you holy apostles and prophets, for God has avenged you on her, and in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and of all who were slain on the earth. All right, so these are the ones who did respond to Jesus' instruction to come out. They were faithful even to death to the Lord. And so as a consequence, they didn't suffer total loss like these other people who were intricately tied in and integrated into the city. So because of this, they're able to take joy because justice is restored. There is an avenging here. There's a reckoning. This terrible wrong, this terrible evil that has been allowed to triumph for so long is finally put down, and things that are wrong are finally made right. So just, again, put this in contrast to 11:10. Remember what happened when the two witnesses were put down, when they were killed? What happened? All the cities of the earth rejoiced because they did not have to have their consciences pricked, and they didn't have to be bugged and aggravated by these two witnesses anymore. And then, of course, they were horrified when they saw, oh no, they've been raised from the dead. So, again, what was the joy that was there? That was totally selfish. This is not a selfish kind of joy, a selfish kind of rejoicing that's happening here. This is because this is a much bigger picture. There is something entirely wrong with the world, and now it has been righted, and God has triumphed, and wickedness has been put in its proper place. So, just notice here it says that in her was found the blood of all the prophets and saints, or blood of prophets and saints, and of all those who were slain on the earth. Haley makes the point in his commentary that this is an indication that we should try to generalize this even beyond Rome, that Rome is a type or a symbol of all worldliness. And I think that's a step too far. That takes us down a slippery slope of kind of overgeneralizing everything in the original point such that it doesn't have meaning. I think this is really like a hyperbole from the standpoint of emphasizing all those that were slain, and then also at the same time, she is responsible. She is the one who is driving all of this. So even though it may have not been in Rome's city limits where all these people were killed, why were these people being killed in Asia Minor and in all these other places? It was because of the pressure and the direction and the influence that Rome was pushing. So Deuteronomy 19:16 through 21 is an interesting passage where it talks about for the Israelites that if somebody brought an accusation, said this person should be put to death, that they and the witnesses would also be closely investigated and considered, and if it was found that they brought false charges, then it would be done to them what they intended to do to the other person. So in essence, these people, Rome, if you will, has brought charges and is convicted and even slain God's people, saying they are the worst of the earth, they are the cause for all of our plagues and everything that's happening to us, and the gods are against them, and they're against us because of them. And so we see the turnabout that God has now spoken and said, no, it's your own wickedness that this judgment is falling on you. So fulfillment of Deuteronomy 19:16 to 21 there. All right, so just again a reminder, remember she's the one who's sitting on the beast, controlling and influence it. Same position as the heads as well, so she's in this position of responsibility. All right, any other thoughts about this one? Comments or questions?
Kind of hitting me that
Mm-hmm.
when John writes, "Rejoice over her, O heavens, and you holy apostles and prophets." If he's writing this on Patmos when he might be the last apostle still alive, the other ones that have suffered this persecution and died from it,
Yeah.
he can write this essentially to them and say, "You're going to be avenged."
Yeah. It would have a lot more personal meaning to him than I think we can begin to relate to. Good point. All right. So, the great fall to be avoided. We've seen the reaction. Now we want to talk a little bit more about the fall itself and how it occurred. So we see this great angel who comes and throws this great millstone into the sea. What is the significance that's attached to the millstone that's being thrown into the sea?
It's never coming back. It's going straight to the bottom. It's not coming back up. And that's what the angel says there. He says, and it will not be found any longer.
All right, very good. I think there's 2 points there, at least, so maybe more, but 2 that came to my mind. So one is the suddenness. This is something that's done. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone, threw it into the sea, saying, "Thus with violence the great city Babylon shall be thrown down and shall not be found anymore." So one, not coming back. But the other thing is, just think about a stone of that size being chunked into the sea. I mean, from the times that you were younger, you've thrown big rocks into the water, and what happens? A huge splash, right? Again, this is emphasizing also the tremendous splash of Babylon being destroyed. Again, the impact that this would have. So, just a few other thoughts. This is the 3rd time we've seen a strong angel. There could be a contrast here. Remember, great Babylon, that mighty city, that's the same word, mighty and strong. It's Iskuros, I believe, or something like that. So, as mighty as Babylon was, there was nothing against this angel with the proclamation. The other place we'll see this is we'll read about the mighty men who were mighty men of flesh and of valor, and they will fall, and that's not going to make any difference as well. So again, there's kind of a contrast here that people building their might, if you will, in the wrong places, and at the end, that kind of might is not enough to withstand God's might. All right, so we've got this giant splash graphically depicting the violence associated with their destruction being broadly seen, and then also the idea of it not coming back. There's kind of a similar thought at the end of Jeremiah 51 and 61 through 64, where Jeremiah has Sariah to go and read things that are written and that I believe are included in the book of Jeremiah against Babylon and other nations, and he ties it to a stone and he chunks it into the river Euphrates, and he says, in essence, in the same way, Babylon will sink and will not be found anymore. So it's the same kind of point also being brought out here in a similar imagery as well. All right, so closely associated with this, how is Babylon described after its fall? What does the city look like?
Nothing productive was happening, and there was no joy found left in it.
So notice this kind of over and over again, not in you anymore. The sound of harpists, musicians, flutists, and trumpeters shall not be heard in you anymore. No craftsman of any craft shall be found in you anymore. And the sound of a millstone shall not be heard in you anymore. The light of a lamp shall not shine in you anymore. And the voice of a bridegroom and bride shall not be heard in you anymore. For your merchants were the great men of the earth, for by your sorcery all the nations were deceived. So all the things that have to do with joy, happiness, construction, progress, building, all of those things are gone. They're all taken away. So again, just kind of emphasizing through this repetition, again, helping us not to kind of oversimplify and think too little of this. This is kind of being pounded in, the destruction and the ruin of the city. So this is the result of all of this lust and immorality that they've peddled throughout the world. Just kind of a side point, we've been looking at this word sorcery over and over again. It's the word pharmakia. And you may recognize that word as our language from pharmacy or pharmacist. It's actually, the primary meaning is the use of like drugs and poisons and toxins. And the reason is, I mean, if you've ever watched, there's what's the River Monsters show, Caleb, that we used to watch? Every single time, what's the guy's name? Jeremy Wade, yeah. Every time he goes to these villages and he wants to go fish some ancient, large, sacred fish or whatever. And they're like, oh, you've got to talk to the witch doctor first. He's like, okay. And they're like, you need to have a vision with the spirits. And the first thing they always do, here, smoke this. Here, drink this, and then you'll see the spirits. Oh, yeah. Because they're giving him drugs and toxins and floating him up to cloud 9, and he's seeing all kinds of crazy things. That's where this sorcery, this is actually the word here. How did people practice witchcraft? How did they see visions and stuff? This wasn't just sleight of hand, like, oh, look, there's a quarter behind your ear. No, they were giving people hard narcotics. And then because of that, they were seeing all kinds of things. So this is very closely associated with we could think more closely of like hard drugs that people might take today, recreational drugs, or in this case, they're using it to deceive people. So this is a direct tie back to this cup of the wine of fornication, how she made people drunk, and that she was drunk with the blood of the saints, and the mixing and the double. So this is, again, a tie back to all of those statements that we've been looking at. And this being the tool that she's been using, and this is the reason for her destruction, and it's highlighted here again. So, this is kind of the big challenge then. All right, so you've probably even heard the phrase, Rome, the eternal city. Why do people keep saying that? Because it's still there. In fact, the entire city of Rome was never burned to the ground. So all the things that we were just talking about, trade, commerce, marriages, businesses, construction, they're still there. They're still in Rome, and that's still happening today. So how do we reconcile these symbols with history? Is that even possible? And if it is, then how do we do it? What do they apply to?
It's not the same Rome that was back then. It's like an empty shell of what it used to be. It has no relation except for in the name to the original city.
All right. So same geography.
Yeah.
And we could say even the same buildings in some cases, but it's not the same Rome. Do we see that with any other governments, any other politics? Have we ever seen one nation come in, remove all the leaders, sit in the same chairs at the same desk, and it be an entirely different government and entirely different people? Yeah. I mean, those kinds of coups and rebellions and overthrows and sacks, they happen, and one takes over behind the other, and that group, that collective is gone, even though the buildings themselves are still standing and may not be destroyed. So this, I will confess to you, this is one part where I'm very weak in the class. There is so much information on the history of Rome over hundreds of years. And if you go and if you spend a lot of time with that, there is wonderful examples of a lot of these things happening, and a lot of the symbols that we're kind of talking about what they mean, and not going, we're going into specifics saying it would be like a leader was fallen, or like, if you go through and read that, there is plenty of very specific people with names, dates, and places that you can apply to those, any number of those. One of the ones I was reading about, and I meant to look it up and I forgot, it was one of the emperors. I want to say he was the grandfather of Constantine the Great, and I've forgotten his name. But he decided that the empire was getting too big, and so he made his son emperor over in Rome while he went and took care of the Eastern Front. And there would become a bigger and bigger push to try to do this, but he was one of the first people to do it. And so he went in, and there was a great battle in the empire of, it was related to the Parthian Empire, but it was there by the river Euphrates. They actually captured him, and he became a prisoner of war, and he spent the rest of his days in this Parthian, I forget the name of the empire that they call it, but that's where he stayed. They captured him, they held on to the emperor. And so remember we were talking about the star that fell and the star being the rulers. This is a wonderful application to the river Euphrates, actually literally being an application there as well. And the fear associated with that and the threats being there, there's countless number of those. Rome did actually fall in a day. and much of the city was burned. It was sacked actually multiple times. And so there's lots of occasions that we can go and look at literally in history where these things would have been applying. But I don't think that's the primary point. And again, thinking of the buildings, we're talking about the people, we're talking about the influencers, we're talking about the collective. This is what is ultimately the target of all of these things. So as we think about the great city, think more not of these buildings, of the location, but think of the people, its spirit, its glory, its allure, its image, its reputation, its influence, the pagan and blasphemous persecuting collective of John's day. So that's not hard for us to think about as well. Think about all the people, whether in Facebook or YouTube or all the other kind of influencers. Is it their channel, or is it YouTube itself, or is it the person behind that? What is the thing that is really the source of the problem? And so this is what we're looking at in Revelation, is the people, the influencers. That is ultimately the target. And then the government and the relations, the alliances, all of those things that they have formed, all of that is completely destroyed. Even if the physical buildings were not burned to the ground, even though there were multiple cases where that almost happened actually in reality as well. So I would say that those kinds of burnings and those other things were occasions for the destruction of those people and for their machines and their alliances, not necessarily the actual physical buildings itself and the geography. All right. I think that's one of the hardest parts of this book, is we keep thinking about the physical city as opposed to the people and the government and that kind of political, social side of things. So, any questions, comments, or thoughts? All right, we'll look at this one more time as we get into chapter 19 as well, as we begin to talk about the marriage feast and the great battle of Armageddon. So, again, we're going to shift from, we're kind of making a natural shift. We're looking at the harlot, the people that have mourned over her, how heaven and how the people destroyed by her are supposed to react, and now we see the actual reaction over her destruction. So who is praising the Lord in this case? All right. And then, kind of closely associated with this, I changed this question slightly. How extensive was her destruction?
Her smoke rises up forever and ever.
Yep. So notice the components, the people here that are rejoicing. A great multitude in heaven saying Alleluia. And then we have the 24 elders, the 4 living creatures. This is the same scene of chapter 4. Remember that throne scene? We have all of these people here that are now reacting in praise for what has happened. And then a voice coming from the throne, praise our God, all you his servants and those who fear him, both small and great. And I heard, as it were, the voice of a great multitude, the sound of many waters, and as the sound of mighty thundering, saying, Alleluia, for the Lord God omnipotent reigns. So we have all the host of heaven, and then this unidentified voice. It could be an angel, maybe it's the living creature. It's something that's coming from the throne. It could be Jesus. Jesus did speak of God in this way in John 20:17. So it could be him also. But anyway, again, pointing all praise to God because of the destruction of the harlot. And notice her smoke rises up forever and ever. So where there's smoke, there's fire. So where there's fire, there's destruction. So if her smoke is continuing to rise forever and ever, then she's continuing to be burnt, destroyed. So this is not something that she's going to be able to question. She's not going to be able to overturn the judgment. She's not coming back. So this is the end of her. This is the finality of Rome. All right, now let's look at God. How is he described in this context? We saw the praises directed towards him and the Alleluias. How does his judgment against the harlot result in this kind of praise?
It's talking about
All right.
the salvation he brings to them.
All right, very good. So, again, noticing as this is kind of concluding a lot of the questions, a lot of the themes that we've been building up to, a lot of these themes are slowly being kind of resolved and taken care of. So, does he know? Does he care? Is he going to do anything about it? Can he do anything about it? Again, we're seeing the final resolution of these things. Notice salvation, glory, honor, and power belong to the Lord our God, for true and righteous are his judgments. Why? Because he judged the great harlot who corrupted the earth with her fornication, and he has avenged on her the blood of his servants shed by her. So that twofold focus there. Here's someone who's doing something wrong, that's wicked, that's doing terrible harm, deal with her. But also his people have been mistreated. He's dealing with that as well. So on both sides of that, he is addressing both of those issues. So they're saying hallelujah. This is our word for hallelujah over and over again. By the way, if I remember correctly, this is the only time it occurs actually in the New Testament where you see this word. But the conclusion for the Lord God omnipotent reigns. So there's people who take up positions of power and reign, but don't have the power to follow through. There's people who have power, but then they don't use it. God does both. He has all power, and he's exercising it. He is reigning and using his authority. So again, we've got this contrast to this tremendous city. Who is like this great city? The Lamb, his army. God is the one that judges her. And then he's righteous in responding to her and dealing with her and righting the wrongs. So just as she unjustly murdered his people, she is being now justly executed and destroyed as well. All right. So much we could say. Thoughts, questions, comments? All right. So let's talk about the preparation for the marriage feast. He says, let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready. And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous act of the saints. Then he said to me, right, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he said to me, these are the true sayings of God. So this brings up a question of Jewish weddings. They were not like ours. And so marriage suppers, that's not something that we do. This is something that was more unique to their kinds of customs. So if you were able to research it, what are the phases of Jewish weddings? So that's number one. And then number two is in that, what's the significance of the marriage supper or the marriage feast? Anybody have a chance to look at this?
They have a much longer engagement periods than we do, and the feast can come at any time in the middle of the night, so you have to be ready for it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't last just one day.
Yeah. All right. So there is a contract phase. The groom and the father, they negotiate for the bride, paying the bride price. They call this the ketubah. That refers to the marriage contract and the mohar. I have no idea if I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it correctly. That's the bride price. You can see that occurring through the book of Genesis repeatedly. Then they have the betrothal period. This is a period of time where both are there. It's like an engagement in that they're committed, but it's much stronger in the sense that if they want to break it off, they actually have to go through the divorce process. And so this is how we find Mary and Joseph at the beginning of Matthew 1. And so where he was considering putting her away. He was considering divorcing her, even though she wasn't technically his wife at this point. So they have this betrothal period. And then, as Caleb mentioned, there's this procession where the groom comes at an unknown time for his bride. Example of this is in the parable of Matthew 25. Remember the groom comes and there's the 10 virgins who are waiting, and then some are let in to the actual feast, and some are not ready, and so they're not let in. And so that's also an example there as well. So then you have this celebration of friends and family. And then after that feast is over, then now finally they are married and they begin their life together. So those are the phases of that. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we go through this next section, because it's going to be important to try to understand the other things that are brought up. So how is the Lamb's wife described? And what's the point? What does this represent?
She's made herself ready. And she's clad with fine linen, clean and bright.
All right. So it says, "Let us be glad and rejoice, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready. And to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints." So I think this is talking about the ongoing betrothal, this preparation period awaiting the marriage feast. It's interesting, he says, to her it was granted. So whether this is her father or this is something that's been given to her, that she is allowed to be able to array herself. This is not something she would have been able to do. And so I think this is an interesting picture of how in our sin we cannot make ourselves look this way. But she has been granted to her to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright. For the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. So she prepares herself, and I want to stop and interrupt this with another question before I go into it further. So who is represented by the Lamb's wife? Kind of already given it away.
Saints.
The saints. And if we think back to our original use of a woman and her children, if we have the individuals being the children, being the saints, then what is the woman?
The church.
The church. That is the collective. That is the institution to which we belong. So what does the marriage supper represent? So we have the exact same parallel we see actually playing out in the plan of salvation. The father and the groom negotiate for the bride, for paying the bride price. What is the price that is paid for us? It's Jesus. It's on the cross. God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. Ephesians 5 is interesting because as he's talking about the husband and wife, and he says, but I'm really talking about Jesus and the church. In Acts 20:28, how he gave himself for her. So we have the betrothal process. This is the period that we're in right now. This is the period of separation where we are preparing ourselves, we're sanctifying ourselves. Paul makes that very clear in 2 Corinthians 11:2, that he is preparing them so that he may present them to the groom. So this is the period of time that we're in. Remember, Jesus himself talked about in John 14 that he leaves so that he can make a place for us. So at some unknown point in time in the future, the groom will return. And it's typically preceded with a shout, an announcement to bring the bride to the marriage feast. So that makes us think about the real end of the world when Jesus returns with his angels and at an unknown time and begins the separation. And at that point, we have the feast where we are united with Jesus, with God's people, and then we begin the cohabitation, the living together, being forever with God in heaven. So we see that exact same process, that analogy being applied to the redemption of the church and God finally having this relationship, this people that he's been seeking for. So let's go back to our picture that we've been talking about, the contrasting sides. We've seen Babylon, the harlot, the city of Rome being taken out, and now we've identified who is the opposing side, who is the woman on the other side. It's the church, it's the saints. That is the institution for which Christ gave his life and his taking as her wife. So, and here's the interesting thought to me, as you think about all of this symbol we've been using over and over again about the harlots, about those who prostituted themselves for who were they prostituting themselves against? Who was the husband on the other side? Who is the suitor, if you will, that would consider these as possible options? It was God. So Assyria, Babylon, Tyre, Israel, Judah, Jerusalem, and now Rome. None of these were suitable wives, companions for God. All of them had the potential to be that, but they ultimately failed in being what God wanted them to be. We're seeing this in the auditorium class for those that are there. we're looking at the fall of Judah, of these kings that come before. They have good points, but none of them live up to being like Jesus. None of them end up being like the Messiah. So we're seeing this continual failure in varying degrees of all of these human institutions, these carnal groups that cannot possibly satisfy what God is looking for in a spiritual people. So the Lamb's wife represents the culmination, what God is looking for. So she's purchased with the Lamb's blood. She is the one that's adorned with the proper garments. And so, again, we've got this blessing are those that are called to the marriage supper. This is something that's coming. So again, just for food for thought, for application, thinking about, are we responding to that call? Or are we like the man who came to the marriage feast and he wasn't in the right garments? And he said, man, how'd you get in here? And he has him cast out. And so are we like that person? We're showing up, but we're not appropriately dressed for the occasion, and we're going to be kicked out. We're not going to be allowed to participate. So again, making personal application, thinking about this special time of, are we making ourselves ready for this eternity, this relationship with God, with Jesus, with our Maker, with our Creator? Are we preparing ourselves, making ourselves clean, being adorned in this clothing that's provided for us? So, again, continuing this analogy, if the bridegroom's delayed, are we going to be prepared? Or are we going to be like the foolish virgins who've run out of oil? Will he find us being chaste, like Paul talked about in 2 Corinthians 11, 2-3? So we see all parts of this kind of analogy, if you will, kind of coming together throughout all of Scripture, being pulled together here at the end of Revelation. The only thing that's kind of left out at this point is, okay, if all that's going to happen, then what about the bride's price? How is that going to be paid? What is the gift that the groom is going to get for his bride? And so we're going to have to pick that up for next time. So again, thank you all for coming, for attending, participating, preparing in advance. And if you got any questions in the meantime, just holler at me.